I always believed that trust was the cornerstone of a marriage. That's what I told myself every time my husband David made another promise about our future together, about the business he said we were building, about the dream he claimed was ours. So when he came to me, eyes wide with urgency, telling me that his company was about to collapse without immediate funding, I didn't hesitate. I drained my personal savings, cashed out a portion of my 401k, and even borrowed against the modest equity in my condo. Altogether, I handed him $180,000. Not as a loan, not with the contract, but with the kind of blind loyalty that only a fool mistakes for love. I never imagined that a year later, I would be standing alone in his home office, clutching a set of legal documents that made my blood run cold. I hadn't been snooping. I'd gone in there looking for a charger, but the manila folder sitting half-tucked under the edge of his desk caught my eye. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, except my name was on the tab. Curious, I pulled it out, expecting perhaps some paperwork about our joint taxes or my retirement contributions. Instead, what I found was a signed and notarized ownership transfer form. I read the lines once, twice, 3 times, refusing to believe what my eyes were telling me. The business that I had helped save with almost everything I had wasn't in David's name anymore. It belonged to someone named Cassandra Brooks. I didn't know anyone by that name. I sat down heavily in the office chair, flipping through the rest of the folder. There were emails printed out, invoices, bank transfer records, an entire trail leading straight to this, Cassandra. My heart slammed against my ribs as the realization hit me like a freight train. David had taken my money, used it to resuscitate his business, and then handed it over to someone else. Not just anyone either. A few quick searches on his laptop, which he carelessly left open and unlocked, revealed photos of Cassandra. Young, blonde, smiling too intimately with David at what looked suspiciously like a private event. She wasn't a business partner. She was his mistress. I sat frozen. The documents spread around me like the shattered pieces of my life. I replayed every conversation David and I had over the past year. The late-night talks about sacrifice, about investing in our future, about building something that would be ours. Every tender touch, every reassuring smile now felt like part of an elaborate performance. I had been financing not only his dreams, but his betrayal. And the worst part? I hadn't seen it coming, not even close. The day I wired him the money was still seared into my memory. He'd held my hands across the kitchen table, his voice trembling with emotion, thanking me for believing in him when nobody else would. He said the business just needed one last push, that the banks wouldn't understand the vision, that only someone who truly loved him could see the potential he had. I remembered feeling so proud in that moment, thinking I was part of something bigger than myself, something beautiful that would reward us both in time. I had envisioned years of prosperity, maybe even opening another branch together, watching him beam with pride, knowing we had done it side by side. Instead, I was looking at proof that I was nothing more than a stepping stone, a convenient ATM with a heart too soft and eyes too blind. I picked up one of the emails and read the first few lines. It was between David and his attorney. The subject line was chilling in its coldness. Finalized ownership transfer. CB Holdings LLC. In the body of the message, David wrote, "I trust everything is settled. Cassandra will be handling client-facing operations going forward. No need to involve Kristen in any official capacities. She was never formally tied to the company. My name, after all my sacrifices, didn't even warrant a second thought." I don't know how long I sat there, numb and shaking, before I finally stood up. I gathered the papers, stuffed them back into the folder, and tucked it under my arm. A part of me wanted to storm into whatever meeting David was in and shove the evidence in his face, demand answers, scream, cry, break something, anything. But another, quieter part of me, the part that had been stepped on, overlooked, underestimated for far too long, stopped me. Dude, not yet, not like this. David thought he had won, that he had played me for a fool and secured his happy ending. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. He didn't know that the woman he dismissed as naive was about to become the worst mistake he had ever made. I closed the office door quietly behind me, folder pressed tightly against my chest. I wasn't going to confront him tonight. I wasn't going to beg or plead for explanations. I was going to make a plan. I was going to strike back, and when I did, David would learn that he hadn't just betrayed a trusting wife, he had created his own downfall. And this time, there would be no one left to save him. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the folder resting on the nightstand beside me like a ticking bomb. Every time I closed my eyes, the same scenes played over and over in my mind. The kitchen table, David's trembling voice, the glint of supposed gratitude in his eyes as he pocketed my future. In the early hours of the morning, as the first weak light filtered through the blinds, I realized something crucial. David's betrayal hadn't started with that ownership transfer. It hadn't even started when he met Cassandra. No, it had begun long before, slow, methodical, and terrifyingly deliberate. The realization stung. He had been grooming me for this, preparing the ground for months, maybe even years, laying the emotional traps carefully, one by one. Every grand gesture, every speech about dreams and loyalty had been designed not just to win my support, but to dismantle any instincts I might have had to protect myself. I was so proud of my ability to manage finances, to stay disciplined and careful with money. David knew that. He knew exactly what strings to pull, what fears to whisper to life, fear of losing him, fear of being seen as selfish, fear of letting down the person I loved most. I remembered how it started. Small at first. Little jokes about how uptight I was with money, how maybe I could learn to take a few more risks like he did, how successful entrepreneurs didn't penny pinch. Then there were the emotional appeals, the stories of his father, a failed small business owner, and how David wanted to redeem that legacy, the way he framed every request for help as something that would bring us closer, something that would give us our life instead of just his. The night he first mentioned needing capital, we had been sitting on the back porch, the summer air thick with the smell of cut grass and barbecue smoke from a neighbor's yard. David leaned back in his chair, beer in hand, looking more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. He spoke of sleepless nights, of contracts he couldn't fulfill, of payrolls he couldn't meet. He said he felt like he was failing me, failing us. His voice broke slightly when he said that if the business folded, he wouldn't be able to look me in the eyes again. That's when he asked if I would consider helping him just to get through this rough patch. I said yes without even thinking, not because I didn't understand the risks, believe me, I did, but because I believed in him, or maybe more accurately, because I needed to believe in him. I needed to believe that loyalty and sacrifice meant something, that if you stood by someone when they needed you most, they would never forget it, never betray it. David didn't ask for all the money at once. That would have been too obvious. He started small, $20,000 here to cover a supplier, another $15,000 to secure a client contract. Every time he was grateful. Every time he told me it was temporary, a bridge to the better future we were building together. By the time he came to me for the final lump sum, claiming it was to close a major expansion deal, I was already so deeply entangled emotionally and financially that refusing him felt unthinkable. I thought about the day I wired the final transfer, how he'd kissed my forehead and whispered, "You're my angel, I'll make you proud." How he'd promised that by this time next year we would be celebrating in Italy or Paris, drinking champagne under the stars. He had smiled at me like I was the only woman in the world. Meanwhile, he was already handing over everything I had built to someone else. The more I pieced it together, the more nauseated I felt. I had been the mark all along, his backup plan, the security net he needed to launch his real life, the one he wanted with Cassandra. It was never about us. It was never about the business. It was about using me just long enough to climb over me and onto the next stage of his carefully constructed fantasy. At around 5 a.m, I finally dragged myself out of bed. I couldn't stand lying there anymore, stewing in humiliation and rage. I made a pot of coffee, black and bitter, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the growing stack of evidence against him. I wasn't stupid. I knew better than to confront him directly. Men like David were experts at spinning the truth, at making you question your own memories. No, I needed a plan. I needed proof, airtight and undeniable. And I needed time to gather it without tipping my hand. First, I printed everything. Every email, every ownership document, every transaction I could find that linked my money to his company, I logged into our joint accounts and took screenshots of every transfer I had made on his behalf. Then I dug deeper. I pulled his corporate records, tracing the timeline of when he registered the new ownership under Cassandra's name. It dated back almost 6 months, meaning he started the transfer process only a few weeks after I gave him the bulk of the money. The betrayal was premeditated. That knowledge hardened something inside me, turned the grief into a kind of cold, surgical anger. It wasn't just that he had cheated me, it was that he had never even hesitated. I spent the entire day assembling a timeline, cataloging every piece of evidence into a binder. I barely noticed when David texted me around noon something about being stuck in meetings all day and grabbing dinner with clients later. Lies. I imagined him sitting across from Cassandra at some overpriced restaurant, toasting their bright future together with champagne bought on my dime. By the time evening rolled around, I had a war chest ready, a digital archive on a cloud drive, physical copies stored at a friend's house, a list of contacts for attorneys who specialized in financial fraud and divorce litigation. If David thought he had written me out of his story, he was about to realize how badly he had miscalculated. The last thing I did that night before finally collapsing into bed was write a short note to myself. I taped it inside the binder, right on the first page so that I would see it every time I opened it. It said, "You are not weak, you are not broken, you are the storm." And it's because that's what I was now, a storm he never saw coming. The first time I saw David after discovering the truth, I had to fight the urge to throw the folder in his face and demand answers right there. He came home late, his tie loosened, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and red wine. He kissed me on the cheek with a casualness that made my skin crawl and mumbled something about a killer day at the office before heading straight to the shower. I sat at the kitchen counter, pretending to scroll through my phone, every muscle in my body coiled tight, every nerve ending screaming. But I smiled and nodded and played the part of the oblivious wife, because now it was about the long game. I wasn't going to give him even a whiff of suspicion that anything had changed. Over the next week, I perfected my mask. I listened patiently as he complained about business pressures, feigned excitement when he mentioned potential new deals, laughed at his jokes during dinner. All the while, I was building my case in the background, strengthening the foundation for what I knew had to come next. It wasn't enough to expose him privately. David thrived on reputation, on the illusion of success and control. If I wanted true justice, I needed to take away the thing he prized above all else, his image. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One evening, David mentioned that he was flying to a conference in Miami for business networking. It wasn't unusual, he often traveled for work, but this time he was careless. He left his laptop open while he showered, and curiosity, or maybe instinct, got the better of me. I clicked through his recent searches and found confirmation of my worst fears. A hotel reservation for 2 under a package labeled romantic getaway in names, David Ross and Cassandra Brooks. I stared at the screen, bile rising in my throat. There it was, laid bare, no more excuses, no more plausible deniability. He wasn't just betraying me emotionally or financially, he was building a whole new life funded by my sacrifice. And he was arrogant enough to leave a paper trail. I copied everything. Screenshots, booking confirmations, emails with subject lines like "Count down the days, baby." I saved it all to the cloud and forwarded copies to my personal email account. Then I sat back and thought carefully about my next move. Blowing up his trip would be satisfying, sure, but not strategic. If I wanted real leverage, I had to let him walk right into the trap he had set for himself. So I packed a suitcase for him, kissed him goodbye at the airport, and even texted him a sweet message about missing him already after he boarded. Meanwhile, I scheduled a meeting with a divorce attorney whose reputation for ruthless efficiency made even seasoned businessmen sweat. Her name was Marissa Kent, and from the moment I sat down in her sleek, glass-walled office, I knew I was in the right hands. "You are not here to negotiate," Marissa said after hearing my story. "You're here to win." Exactly. Over the next 2 days, while David sipped cocktails by the beach with his mistress, Marissa and I put together a legal assault plan that would make even the most seasoned sharks proud. Because David hadn't just emotionally betrayed me, he had committed financial fraud by misappropriating marital assets. The $180,000 I had given him was marital property, and by transferring ownership of the company without my consent, he had exposed himself to serious legal consequences. With the evidence I had meticulously collected, we could not only sue for the return of my money, but potentially seize other assets as well. And that was just the beginning. Marissa recommended we also file complaints with the IRS and the SEC. If David had falsified business documents to hide my financial contributions, which, based on the shady transactions I had uncovered, he clearly had, then he could be facing audits, fines, even criminal charges. Suddenly, the man who thought he was invincible looked a lot more vulnerable. Timing was crucial. We agreed that I would file for divorce and serve him the papers while he was still in Miami, publicly humiliating him at the conference where he was supposedly expanding his business empire. Marissa even arranged for a process server to deliver the paperwork directly at a networking breakfast where half of the regional business community would be in attendance. The morning of the event, I barely slept. My nerves were electric, my hands trembling slightly as I imagined the scene unfolding hundreds of miles away. At exactly 9:03 a.m., I received a text from Marissa's office. Service complete. No details. No theatrics. Just cold clinical confirmation that the bomb had been dropped. I spent the rest of the day pretending to be busy, answering work emails, reorganizing the kitchen drawers, anything to keep my mind occupied. Around 7 p.m., my phone rang. It was David. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, and again. By the fourth missed call, he finally left a message, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. Kristen, what the hell is this? You're ruining everything. You don't understand what you're doing. Call me back. We can fix this. I laughed out loud. Fix this? There was no fixing this. There was only retribution. The next day, Marissa filed motions to freeze our joint bank accounts and request a forensic audit of David's business records. Simultaneously, the IRS confirmed receipt of the anonymous tip-off I had submitted, flagging suspicious activity in David's corporate filings. Within 48 hours, he was locked out of his accounts, his credit cards declined, his business flagged for investigation. Meanwhile, social media exploded with gossip from the conference. Someone had leaked photos of the process server handing David the divorce papers right in the middle of a keynote luncheon. Word spread quickly. David Ross, the rising star entrepreneur, being publicly exposed by his devastated wife for financial betrayal and personal misconduct. Clients started pulling out of contracts. Investors demanded audits. Even his so-called friends began distancing themselves, eager to avoid the fallout. And David started unraveling. First came the angry texts, full of blame and vitriol, then the desperate ones, begging for forgiveness, for another chance. Promises to make it right, to sell the business and give me whatever I wanted. But it was too late. The business wasn't his to sell anymore. Cassandra had disappeared the moment the money dried up, leaving him to face the wreckage alone. One evening, sitting alone in the living room with a glass of wine, I listened to one of his voicemails, marveling at how quickly the man who once held all the power had crumbled into a begging, broken shell of himself. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice cracking. "We were supposed to build something together. I love you. I need you." "No, David, you needed me when you needed saving. You loved what I could do for you, not who I was. And now you would pay the price for underestimating me. Because I wasn't the fool he thought he married. I wasn't his safety net. I wasn't his stepping stone. It was the reckoning he never saw coming." The morning after David's fourth desperate voicemail, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at the checklist Marissa and I had put together. I had already set in motion the financial freezing of our accounts, the audit demands, and the IRS investigation, but there was still more to do if I wanted to make sure he could never claw his way back to the life he thought he deserved. It wasn't enough for him to feel regret. I needed him to feel the irreversible collapse of everything he had built on lies. I needed to make sure the wreckage he left behind would be his permanent legacy. The first step was finishing the forensic audit we had demanded through the divorce proceedings. David, arrogant as always, believed his creative accounting could withstand scrutiny. What he hadn't anticipated was just how thorough Marissa's financial investigators were. Within 2 weeks, they uncovered a series of illegal transactions hidden beneath layers of shell companies, payments funneled to Cassandra under the guise of consulting fees, unreported income, tax evasion schemes. Every shady trick he thought he'd buried was now neatly cataloged, time-stamped, and ready for court. When the initial audit results landed in Marissa's office, she called me immediately. Her voice was crisp and pleased, like a surgeon who had found exactly the tumor she needed to cut out. "He's cooked," she said simply. "This isn't just civil fraud. There are potential criminal charges here, and because the majority of the funds originated from your contributions and joint marital assets, we have a strong case to seize everything before he has a chance to hide it." The day we filed the lawsuit to claim not only my original $180,000 0-cents investment, but also punitive damages for financial misconduct, was the day David's life truly began to unravel. Notices went out to his clients and partners that his business was under investigation. His bank accounts were subpoenaed. His remaining investors pulled their funding overnight. One of his largest corporate clients issued a public statement announcing they were suspending all work with him pending legal review, subtly but unmistakably hinting at their intent to sever ties permanently. The fallout was fast and brutal. Within a month, his company's reputation was so thoroughly trashed that even friends he had known for years stopped returning his calls. His social media presence went dark. Cassandra, predictably, had vanished without a trace the moment the first sign of trouble appeared, deleting her accounts and moving out of the condo David had rented for her with my money. He was left alone in a rented corporate apartment he could no longer afford, facing mounting legal bills and frozen assets. Meanwhile, I didn't stop. I attended every court hearing with meticulous preparation, sitting silently but confidently as David and his increasingly frazzled lawyers tried to spin excuses that no one believed. Every time he glanced at me across the courtroom, I could see the dawning horror, the disbelief that I had become the one thing he couldn't manipulate, couldn't charm, couldn't bully into submission. I was no longer the woman who had once sat across from him on our back porch, naively believing in dreams he had never intended to share. I was the architect of his ruin. The most satisfying moment came during a hearing to determine asset division. David's lawyer, a greasy man with too much cologne and not enough common sense, tried to argue that the business was a separate entity, unrelated to our marital assets, and thus immune from seizure. Marissa rose slowly from her chair, a slim file in her hand, and walked to the judge's bench. Without a word, she handed over copies of the corporate registration documents David had filed months earlier, documents that not only listed him and Cassandra as primary owners, but also cited my initial investment as foundational startup capital. The judge flipped through the papers, his expression growing colder by the second. Finally, he looked over his glasses at David. "It appears, Mr. Ross, that not only did you misrepresent your business dealings to your wife, but you also knowingly engaged in fraudulent transfers of marital assets. Under these circumstances, the court sees no reason to protect any remaining assets from equitable distribution. In fact, given the severity of these findings, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal review." David's face went sheet white. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not the fear of losing money or status, but the fear of losing his freedom. The moment was so pure, so perfect, that I savored it like a rare wine. The final ruling awarded me not just the return of my $180,000 0-cents, but an additional $350 0-cents in damages and attorney's fees. The court ordered immediate seizure and liquidation of all his business assets to satisfy the judgment. Every car, every account, every piece of property David had scrambled to build in his shiny new life was now being sold off at auction to pay for the very woman he had tried to erase. And as if fate wanted to add one final twist of the knife, the local business journal ran a front-page story titled "Rising Star's Spectacular Fall, Fraud Allegations Rock Ross Enterprises," featuring a smiling photo of David from a charity gala we had attended together 2 years earlier. His disgrace was now a matter of public record, searchable by anyone forever. I spent the following week closing the chapter completely. I bought a small but charming commercial property across town using a portion of the settlement money, a space I planned to turn into a boutique marketing consultancy of my own, a place where no one could steal my work, my dreams, or my future ever again. On the day I signed the lease, I sat on the floor of my new office with a bottle of celebratory champagne, staring out the window at the city skyline glowing in the twilight. I thought about David, wherever he was now, probably sitting in some dingy apartment surrounded by unpaid bills and the bitter aftertaste of a life he could never rebuild. He had built his empire on deceit, thinking he was the mastermind, but in the end, he wasn't the architect. I raised my glass silently to the horizon, to new beginnings, to hard lessons learned, and to the simple, brutal beauty of justice well earned. Because David had underestimated me once, he would never get the chance to do it again. The news of the court ruling spread faster than I expected. Within days, David's professional circles were buzzing with whispers about the judgment, the fraud allegations, and the upcoming investigation. Former clients began quietly removing his company's logos from their websites. Vendors canceled contracts. His phone, once a constant stream of business calls and opportunities, now sat silent on his desk, flashing only occasional missed calls from debt collectors or desperate pleas from investors who wanted their money back. But I wasn't finished yet. I knew from the beginning that David's collapse wouldn't be complete until I ensured every avenue he could use to rebuild was cut off. I wanted the consequences to be permanent, not something he could weasel out of with time, charm, and half-truths. With Marissa's guidance, I filed additional reports with the IRS, the SEC, and the Department of Revenue. We compiled every suspicious transaction, every fraudulent transfer, every misrepresentation tied to his businesses. Marissa's investigators uncovered offshore accounts he had tried to set up under Cassandra's name, poorly hidden, laughably amateurish attempts to shield assets. The feds didn't find it funny. They froze the accounts within days. David was served again, this time with notices of federal audits and potential charges for tax evasion and wire fraud. Watching the noose tighten around him was almost surreal. For months, I had lived under the weight of betrayal, humiliation, and fear. Now it was David who couldn't sleep, who watched every incoming call with dread, who walked into every meeting wondering if it would be his last as a free man. He tried reaching out again after the federal notices hit. This time, his tone was different, less anger, more desperation. He left a voicemail one night, his voice hoarse and shaking. "Kristen, please. I made mistakes, but you're destroying my life. We don't have to do this. We can work something out. I'll sell what's left. I'll give you whatever you want. Just call me. Please." I deleted the message without even listening to the end. It was far too late for negotiations. David wasn't offering anything out of remorse. He was bargaining for survival, and he no longer had anything I wanted. Around the same time, I finalized the paperwork for my new business. I named it Phoenix Consulting, an ironic tribute to the way I had burned my old life down to its foundations and risen from the ashes stronger than ever. I hired a small but brilliant team, many of whom had once worked indirectly with David and had jumped ship the moment his scandal broke. They didn't need convincing. In a world where reputation was everything, mine was now synonymous with resilience, precision, and quiet ruthlessness. The very qualities clients wanted but never dared ask for openly. The grand opening of Phoenix Consulting was a low-key affair by design. No banners, no balloons, no awkward speeches, just a simple gathering of clients, colleagues, and friends who knew the real story behind the success they were witnessing. I stood by the window, a glass of champagne in hand, looking out over the city that had once felt so cold and unattainable. It was mine now. Every inch of it had been earned with fire, grit, and a refusal to be anyone's victim ever again. I heard rumors that David was struggling to find legal representation. His former attorney had dropped him the week after the federal charges were filed, citing irreconcilable differences, which was code for, "You're screwed and I'm not going down with you." The banks had foreclosed on his last remaining properties. His car, once a gleaming status symbol, was repossessed in front of his neighbors. His so-called friends had abandoned him in droves. Cassandra had resurfaced briefly, only to file her own lawsuit against him for breach of promise and emotional distress, hoping to salvage something from the ruins. Watching from a distance, I felt no sympathy, only a cold, distant satisfaction. The final blow came 6 months after the initial court judgment. David was formally indicted on multiple counts of tax fraud and wire fraud. The headlines hit the local news first, then spread nationally. Entrepreneurial star faces federal charges amidst financial scandal. His mugshot, a pale, exhausted version of the man who once thought he could rule the world, was splashed across every major outlet. It was the kind of public destruction that no amount of rebranding, no half-hearted apology tour could ever undo. I didn't attend the criminal trial. There was no need. I had fought my battle and won. The rest was just cleanup. But I did watch the verdict announcement online from the quiet comfort of my office. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing pending. David's lawyer issued a statement blaming personal issues and business pressures, trying to paint him as a tragic figure rather than the calculated predator he truly was. It didn't matter. His fate was sealed. A week later, I received a letter forwarded through Marissa's office. It was from David. Handwritten, 6 pages long. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won out. The letter was exactly what I expected. A pitiful mixture of apologies, excuses, nostalgic memories of better times, and veiled attempts to blame me for going nuclear instead of forgiving him. He begged for understanding. He pleaded for mercy. He talked about how he had lost everything: his business, his reputation, his freedom, his future. I read it once, folded it neatly, and dropped it into the shredder without hesitation. David had made a choice the moment he decided my love and loyalty were weaknesses to be exploited. He could have had a partner for life, a future built on real trust and shared dreams. Instead, he had chosen betrayal, deceit, and greed. Now he would live with the consequences. Alone. Later that evening, as I locked up the office and stepped into the crisp night air, I allowed myself a moment to breathe it all in. The quiet, the certainty, the hard-earned peace. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't grieving. I wasn't even vengeful. I was simply free. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed with a new email notification. It was from a major firm requesting a proposal for a 7-figure contract, an opportunity I would have once thought out of my league. I smiled to myself, a genuine, grounded smile, and slid into the driver's seat, the city lights reflecting off the windshield like tiny galaxies. David had tried to destroy me. Instead, he had set me free. And for the first time in a long time, the future was entirely mine to write. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, a day that dawned crisp and cold with a gray sky hanging low over the city like a heavy curtain. I hadn't planned on attending. I had told myself that it was enough to know the outcome, that I didn't need to witness David's final fall. But when the morning came, something in me shifted. I realized that this wasn't just about closure. It was about reclaiming the narrative of my life, standing in the room where justice would finally be measured out to the man who had tried to erase me. So I dressed carefully. Nothing flashy, nothing designed to draw attention. Just a simple navy suit, clean lines, a sharp silhouette. I wanted to be a silent presence, a reminder to David that he hadn't destroyed me, that I was still standing, stronger than ever. The courthouse was already buzzing when I arrived. Reporters clustered outside the entrance, microphones poised, eyes scanning every person who walked through the doors. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. I took a seat near the back of the courtroom, far enough to be unobtrusive, but close enough to see everything. When David was led in, my breath caught for a moment, not out of lingering affection, but out of the sheer shock of how much he had deteriorated. He looked nothing like the confident, ambitious man I had once loved. His suit hung loosely on his frame, his hair was unkempt, his skin pale and sallow. His eyes scanned the room nervously, and for a brief second, they found mine. He froze. I didn't look away. I wanted him to know that I saw him, that I wasn't hiding, that I wasn't afraid. The proceedings were mercilessly efficient. The prosecutor outlined the charges in clear, methodical detail: wire fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, each count a brick laid neatly atop the last, building the walls of the prison that would soon enclose him. David's defense attorney tried to paint a picture of a man overwhelmed by pressure, a man who had made poor decisions but who deserved leniency for his contributions to the business community. It was a pathetic performance, and the judge was unmoved. When it was David's turn to speak, he shuffled to the podium and gripped the sides tightly, as if afraid he might collapse without the support. His voice cracked as he apologized to the court, to his investors, to his former employees. Not once did he mention me by name. Not once did he acknowledge the real reason he stood there, stripped of everything. It didn't matter. I hadn't come for an apology. I had come for the verdict. When the judge delivered the sentence, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. 5 years in federal prison, full restitution of all proven financial damages, lifetime ban from serving as an executive officer for any public or private company. The words fell like hammer blows, each one nailing shut the coffin of David's old life. He sagged visibly as the guards approached to escort him away. As he passed my row, he glanced at me again. This time, I didn't just hold his gaze. I tilted my chin up slightly, a silent declaration. You lost. Outside the courthouse, the reporters swarmed, but I slipped away unnoticed. I had no interest in being the face of someone else's scandal. I had built my new life quietly, deliberately, and I intended to protect it with the same care. The media frenzy would devour David's story for a few news cycles and then move on. Meanwhile, I would still be here, living, thriving, free. Phoenix Consulting had grown faster than I had dared hope. In less than a year, we had secured contracts with 3 major corporations and expanded into a second office space. My team was loyal, sharp, and fiercely protective of our reputation. Clients came to us not just for results, but for the certainty that we operated with integrity. A direct, ironic contrast to the lessons David had taught me the hard way. Every time I signed a new client contract, every time I walked into a strategy meeting and saw the respect in my colleagues' eyes, I felt another layer of the past peel away, leaving only strength behind. One evening, after a particularly grueling but satisfying project launch, I found myself sitting alone in my office, a glass of wine in hand, staring at the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The skyline glittered like a living thing, pulsing with energy, opportunity, resilience. I thought about the woman I had been 2 years ago, the woman who had believed that love meant sacrifice, that loyalty meant silence, that betrayal was something that only happened to people who weren't careful enough. I wasn't that woman anymore. My phone buzzed with a new message, an old colleague congratulating me on being nominated for a local business leadership award. I smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. Recognition wasn't why I had fought so hard to rebuild, but it was sweet all the same. Proof that I wasn't just surviving. I was winning. Later that night, I opened a blank journal, a habit I had started during the worst of the divorce and legal battles. It had begun as a way to vent, to pour out the anger and despair without judgment. Now, it had become something different, a chronicle of growth, of triumph. I turned to a fresh page and wrote 3 words across the top. I am free. I set the pen down and leaned back in my chair, feeling the words settle into my bones. David Ross was a chapter in my life, but he wasn't the story. The story was mine. Every scar, every victory, every hard-earned inch of the ground I now stood on. He had thought he could break me, reduce me to a footnote in his success story. Instead, I had rewritten the ending. I turned off the lights in the office and stepped into the night. The air was crisp and clear, filled with the scent of possibilities. As I walked toward my car, I felt lighter than I had in years. Unburdened by the past, unafraid of the future. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. A year after David's sentencing, life looked unrecognizable from the one I had left behind. Phoenix Consulting had expanded into new sectors and my team had doubled in size. I spent my days immersed in building strategies for companies that actually valued integrity, innovation, and the people behind the work. In the evenings, I often found myself reflecting on how far I had come, not just professionally. The anger that had once fueled me through long nights of planning my revenge had faded into something quieter, stronger, a deep, unshakable peace. I wasn't running from the past anymore, I had outgrown it. On a warm Friday afternoon, my assistant handed me an envelope with a curious look. No return address. Inside was an invitation printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock. A former business association, one David and I had once attended together, was hosting its annual gala and awards night. To my surprise, they had nominated me for Entrepreneur of the Year. I stared at the card for a long moment, letting the weight of it sink in. The very community that had once celebrated David's flashy but hollow success now recognized my quiet, relentless rebuild. It felt poetic, like life completing a circle I hadn't even realized was still open. I attended the gala alone, walking into the grand ballroom in a simple black dress that spoke volumes without shouting. No one whispered about scandals when I entered, no one cast pitying glances. Instead, people smiled, reached out to shake my hand, congratulated me on my success. It wasn't about David anymore. It was about me, standing entirely on my own merits. When they called my name and I stepped onto the stage to accept the award, I didn't think about revenge or vindication. I thought about resilience, about the nights I had sat alone, terrified and heartbroken, and made the choice to stand up again anyway. After the ceremony, I slipped away from the crowd, preferring the cool quiet of the terrace outside. The city spread out before me, lights flickering like a sea of endless possibilities. I thought about the woman I had become, not hardened, but tempered, like steel forged through fire. I was proud of her. I was proud of every scar, every mistake, every hard lesson that had shaped her into someone capable of not just surviving betrayal, but transforming it into a foundation for a better life. I didn't know where David was now. Somewhere deep inside the federal prison system, serving his time, living out the consequences of choices he had once made so casually. Sometimes I wondered if he thought about me, if he ever realized that by trying to erase me, he had only made me stronger. But I didn't dwell on it. His story was no longer part of mine. I had closed that chapter with finality and grace, leaving no loose ends to pull at my peace. As I stood there, the cool breeze brushing against my skin, I made a quiet promise to myself. Never again would I compromise my worth for someone else's comfort. Never again would I diminish my instincts or silence my voice to fit into someone else's flawed vision. I had built a life on my own terms, with my own hands, and nothing and no one could ever take that away from me again. Eventually, I turned back toward the ballroom, ready to rejoin the celebration, ready to embrace the life I had fought so hard to reclaim. As I walked, I felt light, unburdened by regrets, filled instead with a steady, grounded joy. This wasn't the happy ending David had envisioned when he plotted his betrayal. It was far better. It was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back.